Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the David Hume Institute. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm the director of the Institute. Just a couple more coming in. Can you come? We're very pleased this evening to welcome Carl Emmerson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies at an event sponsored by KPMG, and we're very grateful for KPMG for that. And the question and answer will be chaired by Jenny Stewart, who is a partner in KPMG. She will come up after Carl has spoken. Now, we're entering a new era in Scotland because next year the powers over tax and welfare come into force, which were negotiated part of the Smith Commission, and that means that a substantial proportion of the revenue spent in Scotland will be raised in Scotland. But also a substantial proportion of the revenue spent in Scotland will still be dependent on the UK government, and the Barnett formula is not dead. It lives on, and so the amount of money which the Scottish government gets will be dependent on the Barnett formula and the spending by UK ministries and also the policies made by the Chancellor George Osborne. So what Carl has to say will be very relevant to Scotland, particularly in the later years of this Parliament. For those of you, I'm sure you all do know the Institute for Fiscal Studies. It is the preeminent, independent and impartial commentator on UK fiscal policy. For those of you who don't know the internal structure, Paul Johnson, the director, who has been a speaker at the David Hume Institute several times in the past. Paul appears on television, and it's Carl who actually does the work. So we're delighted to have him here this evening for his first visit to the David Hume Institute. Just give a couple of seconds for our latecomers to arrive. And I have pleasure now handing over to Carl.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, the fiscal rules that the Chancellor has chosen to set himself. I will then focus on the rule which says that by the time of the next UK general election, the deficit should be eliminated. I'll talk about how the Chancellor wants to go about meeting that, what the measures he set out to do that will mean for household incomes, what it will mean for spending on different services. And then finally, I'll turn to talk about some of the risks around those forecasts. What reasons might there be for tax revenues or spending not turning out as Mr. Osborne expects? So starting with the fiscal rules, there are three of them that Mr. Osborne has set himself. The first is to cap the amount of forecast spending on welfare. So it's the bulk of the Social Security and tax credit bill outside of the state pension and some other items. Mr. Osborne announced this about a year ago. Now, a justification for this is that if Social Security spending starts to grow in a way that wasn't previously intended, you might worry that chancellors would take the easy option of just allowing that to happen rather than make unpopular cuts to benefit spending or tax credits. So that's the kind of motivation for having such a cap. If we look in November 2015, when the cap was only a year old, we see that it was already breached. It was breached in 2016-17, 17-18, and 18-19, so 3 out of the 5 years in the forecast, and that was because of Mr. Osborne's decision to U-turn, in the short run at least, on the cuts to tax credits that he announced last July. So it didn't prevent him from choosing not to make some unpopular benefit cuts. Roll forward to March's budget, and he managed a clean sweep. The forecast deteriorated again, and now the cap is breached in all 5 of the next 5 years. So I think we can safely argue that that fiscal rule is now dead. The second fiscal rule that Mr. Osborne set himself was to reduce public sector net debt, so the total indebtedness of the public sector, as a share of national income every single year until we get to budget surplus. So debt can grow, but it has to grow less quickly than the income that the UK economy is generating. And over the longer term, at least, there are very good reasons to want to get that down, to think that you want to have your debt lower as a share of your GDP, for two real reasons. One is you'll end up spending less on debt interest, and you can spend that money on something you'd enjoy, like tax cuts or public services. And secondly, if you've got a lower level of debt, that means if some shock comes along, you may well have more scope to increase that debt in the face of that shock. Now, back in November, this rule was being met, but only because the government was planning to sell off assets. Now, as an economist, I feel a bit uncomfortable about that. Selling off assets for what they're worth doesn't really improve the health of the finances. Just as if a household chooses to sell off some of its assets to pay off some of its debts, it doesn't mean its net worth is actually being improved. And if we go forward to the budget that happened a couple of months ago, we see that actually it was on course to be missed. The forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility suggested that debt was going to go up as a share of GDP in the financial year that's just finished. And the initial outturn that we now have for March 2016 suggests that in fact it did go up. So debt increased more quickly than national income, and therefore, at least according to the initial outturn, this rule has also been missed. So that one's gone too. That leaves us with the third fiscal rule that Mr. Osborne set himself, and that is to achieve a headline surplus to ensure that the total amount of revenue flowing into government exceeded the total amount of spending every single year from 2019-20 onwards, with a caveat that the rule gets suspended if at any point growth drops below 1%. Now, of course, this rule, we won't know if it's been met until around April, May 2020, so we can't tell yet whether or not this rule has been met. So for now, at least, this rule is still standing. But there's some things we can say about it. Firstly, if the UK does get to an overall budget surplus and maintains it, that will be a break from what we've seen in the past. So this graph here shows you the size of the UK deficit as a share of national income each year since 1948. You can see that the record deficit there was in 2009-10 at just over 10% of GDP at the height of the financial crisis and associated recession. You can see since then the coalition government managed to halve that deficit. It fell again last year, but it's still running at 4% of GDP, which is relatively high by historical standards. The forecasts that the Chancellor set out in March imply deficit reduction continuing at a similar pace to what we've been used to since 2010. And if these forecasts are correct, it means in 2019-20 we will indeed be running a surplus. The government will be collecting more in tax and non-tax receipts than it's spending. But you can see the UK doesn't often have budget surpluses. The new Labour government managed them for 3 years. The previous Conservative government managed it for 2 years. Prior to that, we only managed it on 3 occasions since the early 1950s. So in total, we've had 8 years of budget surplus since 1952. So it's not common in the UK, and indeed if you look at other advanced economies, you can see that budget surpluses are rare there too. So getting to one is going to be difficult. Maintaining it would really be a break from what we've seen in the recent past. So that begs the question, should we run budget surpluses? Is it a good thing to get there? Have we been badly behaved over the last 50, 60 years? And a budget surplus, is that something we should be aspiring to get to? Well, I said earlier that there are good reasons to want the size of your debt as a share of your economy down, but it's important to remember that will happen even if your debt grows, as long as it's growing less quickly than your economy is growing. So if your debt is growing at 4% a year, but your economy is growing at 5% a year, your debt as a share of your economy will be falling. And it's worth noting that there's really no economic difference between running a small budget deficit or a small budget surplus. There's nothing magic about having a budget surplus in particular. So, but of course, as long as the surplus isn't harming growth directly, the smaller the deficit you have or the bigger the surplus you have, the more quickly you will get debt down. It will lead to debt falling more quickly, so it will lead to a position where you can enjoy those lower debt interest payments, where you can get to a position where you're less worried perhaps that if a recession came along and you wanted to increase your debt, that you might not be able to do so. So reasons to get debt down, but they don't hinge on having a budget surplus. And there are several reasons why you might want to borrow. The first is because you might want to spend on investment. In this case, governments aren't necessarily any different from households. If households want to carry out an investment, they may often borrow to do it. Most people don't save up until they can afford their first home outright. They typically take a mortgage to do so. Similarly, companies often borrow in order to finance investments that they want to make. There's also some reasons specific to government about why borrowing might be a good thing. It might be good for output stabilisation. You might think it's good for the government to borrow in bad times and then run up surpluses in good times in order to try and smooth the ups and downs of the economic cycle. It might be sensible to adjust gradually to shocks, and in particular in the face of forecast errors. Supposing you got to January of a financial year and all of a sudden it looked like tax revenues were going to disappoint. Do we really think you should do emergency tax increases in February, March of that financial year just to get to budget surplus? Or is it reasonable just to borrow some money in the face of that forecast error and adjust more gradually over time in the way that, again, a household might want to do? And finally, it might make sense to try and smooth tax rates over time. So, for example, if you know you've got an easier time in terms of public spending or in terms of tax receipts ahead of you, you might think rather than put up taxes now, it might be sensible to hold them down and just smooth the rate of tax over time. There's a theory in economics which shows that the distortion caused by taxes relates to the square of that tax, not the level of that tax. So therefore, having smooth taxes over time can be better for welfare rather than having high taxes in some periods and lower taxes in other periods. So lots of reasons why governments might want to borrow. Now, of course, Mr. Osborne isn't blind to these, and in particular on output stabilisation, his fiscal rule has an explicit get-out clause that if growth drops below 1%, the rule is suspended, and he is indeed allowed to borrow. So the rule says that if at any point growth in the economy appears to have dropped below 1%, or if at any point the forecast for growth says it's dropped below 1%, the rule gets suspended, and the Chancellor at the time just has to set out what his or her strategy is for getting back to surplus at some point in the future. And the one thing I think I can definitely say in the fiscal mandate's favour is it's very, very simple to understand. It's very transparent. We'll know for sure whether this rule has been met. And in fact, we will know for sure in April 2020, as we run up to the date of the expected date of the next general election. We'll know whether tax receipts have exceeded spending. We will know if growth, if it hasn't, we'll know if the rule has been suspended because growth has dropped below 1%, or whether the rule is still in place and perhaps therefore being breached. So it's very easy to understand, it's very transparent, although it clearly comes at a cost in terms of some other flaws. What about the 1% escape clause? Is this sensible? Well, the graph here shows you the growth rate that the UK economy has had over each set of 4 quarters since 1955, with the latest set of forecasts going forwards. And this horizontal line shows you where 1% is. So this is the latest outturn for GDP over this period, and if you take this graph as given, you can see that since about 1965 at least, the 1% threshold looks pretty sensibly chosen, in the sense that it would have meant, had this rule been in place, it would have been suspended during the periods of major economic turmoil that the UK experienced. The mid-1970s, the early 1980s, the early 1990s, and the more recent financial crisis. And in fact, for over that period, since 1960, if the Treasury had chosen 0.7 or 1.3, you'd get the same answer. It's not that 1%, it's not that sensitive to the choice of 1%. And we've also looked at the data that were available at the time. These are the latest data. Of course, in real time, we'll be operating off the data that are available at that moment. And again, you don't get that much difference in terms of the picture. The rule would have been suspended in those times of major economic turmoil. It would have been in place for most of the rest of the period. In fact, you can extend the data back about 300 years and you get a similar kind of pattern. What that's saying is that the UK economy doesn't tend to have growth below 1% unless it drops into a full-blown recession. So growth tends to be above 1%. The minute it drops below 1%, it tends to enter negative territory and you get a recession. We don't have prolonged periods where growth is bouncing around 0.9, 1.1, which would make this escape clause really problematic. Why is it okay to borrow if the economy is growing at 0.9%, but not okay to borrow if the economy is growing at 1.1%? At least in recent history, the UK economy doesn't seem to behave like that. But there are 3 problems with the fiscal mandate. First, it's important to remember that there's always errors in forecasts for government borrowing. So if you want to guarantee that you're going to have a surplus every single year, you're either going to have to aim to achieve quite a sizable forecast surplus, just in case some shock comes along and erodes your taxes or puts up spending, or alternatively, you have to be prepared to take very quick action. So supposing we get to April 2019, the start of the financial year in which the Chancellor's rule starts to apply. And supposing he's forecasting a surplus of 0.5% of GDP, £10 billion, that's what he's forecasting at the moment. You might think that's a big buffer. £10 billion is only 12 months to run. Doesn't that mean we'll definitely meet the rule? Well, looking historically and ignoring periods where the economy was growing by less than 1%, this suggests there'd still be a 1 in 4 chance that you'll breach the rule or have to take action in year. So the Chancellor would have a 75% chance of success, but a 25% chance that if he really wanted to deliver a surplus in 2019-20, he would have to announce an emergency budget containing tax rises or spending cuts in year, in the financial year before the UK general election. So a 0.5% of GDP surplus is not much of a buffer. Secondly, economics is not very conclusive about, or it's not conclusive at all about what the optimal level of government debt is or how much the government should borrow in any particular period. But one thing we can be sure about is that the optimal amount of investment spending, the optimal amount of borrowing that government does, will depend, at least in part, on the rate of interest that the government faces. And the fiscal mandate, at least in some cases, rules this out. It doesn't allow a government to borrow more when the price of that borrowing is lower. And as an economist, I feel uncomfortable with that. If the price of something is lower, you tend to want to consume more of it, and the same applies to borrowing. So there may well be periods in which interest rates are very low, the government may see some investment projects as being particularly attractive, and the fiscal rule may stop them from being able to do that. And finally, the 1% threshold on the escape clause is still arbitrary. It's really not clear why a deficit is okay if growth is 0.9%, but a deficit's not okay if growth is just above 1%. Now, I previously showed you that since 1965, at least, this isn't really an issue for the UK economy, but the future may not look like the past. Perhaps in the future we will have prolonged periods where the growth rate of the UK economy will bounce around 1%. That means that, for example, it will matter a lot to the Chancellor, or it could matter a lot to the Chancellor, about whether the OBR happens to say growth is likely to be 1.1%, in which case the fiscal rule is in place. The Chancellor may have to do tax rises or spending cuts to deliver a surplus, or whether the OBR says, actually, we think growth is going to be 0.9%, at which point the rule gets suspended and the Chancellor of the day is allowed to borrow as much as he or she likes. So, at least in the period since 1965, this argument doesn't seem to apply, but there's no reason why the future will necessarily look like the past. The UK might end up having a period in which growth bounces around 1%. Obviously, let's hope not. Okay, so that's a kind of critique of the Chancellor's fiscal rules, and in particular his desire to bring about a budget surplus. I'll now turn to how is he going to do it? How is he going to get to a position where taxes are exceeding spending, having inherited such a large deficit back in 2009-10? And the answer is really through a combination of tax rises and spending cuts. So the chart here starts in 2008-9, so it starts when the financial crisis starts, and it shows the total amount of tax rises and spending cuts that have been announced since the March 2008 budget. So it includes measures announced by Alistair Darling as Chancellor, as well as those announced by George Osborne. So in 2008-9 and 2009-10, you can see the graph is negative. That's a giveaway. The Labour government was introducing temporary spending increases and tax cuts to try and limit the length and depth of the recession. Then you can see the fiscal repair job starts in 2010, with the fiscal stimulus being turned off, and then some tax rises and spending cuts kicking in. And you can see they increase gradually over time until they reach in excess of 10% of GDP by 2019-20. So while part of the deficit is coming down because of economic growth, a large part of it is because of this fiscal response. Statements in budgets which put up our taxes, cut our benefit spending, and cut our public service spending. And by the end of 2015-16, it looks like we've done about 64% of the job done, about 36% to do. So we're about 2/3 of the way through this fiscal repair job. So however painful you think it has been so far, we've got about half as much again ahead of us. And we can split this fiscal response down into where it's coming from. So the blue bit at the bottom shows you the extent to which we are relying on increases in tax to shut the deficit. And then you can see cuts to investment spending, cuts to benefit spending, cuts to debt interest spending, and cuts to other current spending. So that's spending on, for example, the wages of public sector workers. And you can see here that overall, by 2019-20, the cure that the government's implementing comprises about 1/5 tax rises and about 4/5 spending cuts. So that's the mix of fiscal consolidation that we're going for. The government, the coalition government and the Conservative government combined are a government which has put up taxes but done more in terms of spending cuts, or at least that's what they have done, and that is what they are continuing to plan to do. So why are they doing that? Or why are they doing that mix? Well, there's a number of potential reasons, but one is to look at exactly what's happened to the size of the state as we moved through the financial crisis. So this graph here shows you in light green the total amount of receipts flowing into the government. That's receipts from taxes and other receipts the government gets. And in dark green, the total amount of public spending, both of which measured as a share of GDP. And the gap between the two is, when spending is above the receipts, is the deficit. So you can see we had surplus in 2001. We then moved into deficit. 2007-8, before the crisis hit, there was a deficit, a bit bigger than the then Labour government wanted. Their plan was to reduce it. Financial crisis comes along. That's pushed tax receipts down a bit as a share of GDP. But what it's really done is pushed up public spending as a share of GDP. Why has that happened? Well, it's because the amount we spend on public services was all set out before the spending review, spending on things like schools and hospitals. When the growth didn't materialise, when the economy turned out to be much, much smaller, that same level of cash spending in 2010 turned out to be a much larger share of our economy. And you can see going forwards, the forecasts imply the tax burden, current receipts as a share of GDP continuing to rise, and spending as a share of GDP continuing to fall, until in 2019-20 we get into a position where receipts exceed spending. And where receipts exceed spending. And what we can also put onto this graph is what would have happened had we not announced the tax rises and the spending cuts that have been contained in budgets since March 2008. So we can take the costings direct from each budget and autumn statement, and we can subtract that away or add it on to the level of tax and spending that we're actually seeing. And what you can see here is that the green line has been pushed up. That's the tax rises that are happening. The light green line has been pushed up because of the tax rises. The dark green line has been pulled down a lot because of the spending cuts. And one possible justification for doing more in terms of spending cuts than tax rises is we're clearly trying to get back to the kind of level we're at pre-crisis. Although in fact the government's going somewhat further than that, and it's pushing spending back to around the level we saw back in 2001. And at the end of the period, we get to that, if these forecasts turn out to be correct, we get to this surplus of 0.5% of GDP, or £10 billion. And that's a number to bear in mind as I start to talk about some of the risks to these forecasts. A big issue is whether that £10 billion is a big number, is it a lot of money to spare, or is it, as I would argue, actually a relatively small amount of room to manoeuvre, and one that could easily see the Chancellor blown off course. So that's a deficit elimination in the UK. I've got a slide now on what's happening in Scotland. So as I've already shown you, the UK-wide deficit is forecast to be eliminated by 2019-20. Rather than that being driven by strong economic growth, it's really down to a combination of further tax rises and further cuts to public spending. So that begs the question, what about the gap between receipts and spending that's happening in Scotland? Will the deficit be eliminated in Scotland? Will it come down to the same rate as it is in the UK? And if we look at the JERS document, this suggests that in 2014-15, the last year for which we have data, that the Scottish deficit, if you like, the amount of receipts attributable to Scotland, the amount of spending that it attributes to Scotland, was a larger share of the economy than it was for the UK as a whole. Some projections produced by a colleague at IFS, which take these JERS figures and combine them with the latest OBR forecast, suggest that this gap over time, the gap between the UK and Scotland, will widen. And the reason for this is that North Sea oil receipts are growing, or not growing, anywhere near as fast as receipts from onshore activities, and that's much more important for Scotland than it is for the UK as a whole. So what essentially this forecast is assuming is it assumes that all Scottish onshore receipts grow at the same rate as the UK average, and it assumes that the North Sea receipts grow at the same rate as the North Sea receipts for the UK as a whole. So you end up with a position where receipts in Scotland are growing far less quickly than those for the UK as as a whole. So to put some numbers on that, this graph here shows you up to 2014-15, the numbers straight out of JERS, which is suggesting that the difference between the UK deficit and the Scottish deficit is equal to 4.7% of Scottish GDP, or £7.2 billion. Going forwards in yellow, it shows the UK deficit being eliminated, so that's surplus of 0.5% of GDP in 2019-20. It shows in 2015-16 the Scottish deficit actually going up, not falling, because of the fall in the oil price, depressing revenues from North Sea oil and gas production, far more important for Scotland than they are for the UK as a whole. The deficit then does start to fall in Scotland, but not at the same pace as it does for the whole of the UK. So by the end of the period in 2020, you get a gap of 6.7% of GDP, or £12.8 billion in today's terms. So basically a disappearance of oil revenues means that Scotland's fiscal position relative to that of the UK as a whole deteriorates. So that begs the question of, does it matter? Well, were we in a world of full fiscal autonomy, where Scotland was responsible to raise the revenues for all of the spending that it does, or were we in the world of independence, then clearly this would matter a lot. A deficit of 6% of GDP 5 years out would be a very large, to be forecasting a deficit of 6% of GDP in 5 years' time would be a very large deficit for any small, open, advanced economy. But of course, we're not under full fiscal autonomy, and we're not in a situation of independence. There is risk sharing across the UK. The oil revenues are UK oil revenues rather than Scottish ones in this world. And in particular, under the no detriment principle that the Scottish government argued for as part of the recent agreement between the UK government and the Scottish Parliament, it doesn't matter. Essentially, the block grant adjustments that have been agreed means that this will not matter at least until 2021-22. But clearly a risk for Scottish taxpayers is that once we get to 2021-22, when the next negotiation takes place, will the Scottish government be able to argue for the same kind of deal as it did now? Might it be the case that in an era where the UK as a whole perhaps is running a budget surplus, might it be very transparent that the Scottish equivalent is not in surplus? Okay, so that we move away from kind of the fiscal aggregates, I'm now going to talk a bit about what these increases in tax, cuts to benefits, and cuts to public service spending are likely to mean. And I'll start with the tax changes and benefit changes and look at how they will affect different households in terms of their incomes. So this graph here shows you on the very right that the impact of tax changes and benefit changes that are to be implemented over the current Parliament are set on average to reduce household incomes by about 2%. So the net effect of tax rises affecting household incomes and benefit changes affecting household incomes is to drop those household incomes by 2% because they're tax rises and benefit cuts, and they are seeking to reduce the deficit. And you can see how this varies across the income distribution. What we've done here is we've taken a sample of data from the UK. We've divided those households into 10 equally sized groups, from the poorest 10% of households on the left to the richest 10% of households on the right, and we've shown how the losses or gains vary by those types of households. And essentially what you see is a pattern where the burden of those changes is falling far more heavily on the bottom half of the distribution, on average, than it is on the top half. And that's because the benefit cuts are weighing heavily on the bottom half of the distribution, and there are income tax cuts which will affect predominantly those in the top half of the income distribution. For the very richest, there are some tax rises. There's been a clampdown on buy-to-let properties. There's also been some restrictions on pension contribution relief, which are offsetting those tax cuts, meaning that on average, the richest 10% of the population are not gaining from those income tax cuts. We can also look at how it varies by different family types. So if we take households containing a pensioner, you can see their losses on average are much lower. That's because the cuts to benefits are really about cuts to working age benefits. So essentially pensioners are being protected from that. They're still losing a bit. That's because of things like the increase in insurance premium tax that's coming in this Parliament. Working age households that do not contain children, their changes in incomes are very similar to the average. The bigger losses are amongst working age households that do contain children. Why is that? Well, it's because of the fact that a lot of the squeeze is coming from cuts to benefits, we pay far more significant amounts of benefits to families with children than we do to households who do not, or to working age households who do not have children, so they're bearing the brunt of those cuts. This is for UK-wide. We've also crunched the data looking at just Scottish households. In terms of the overall picture, there's not much difference. Two slight differences are that the losses at the bottom are a bit smaller amongst Scottish households. The reason for that is part of the benefit cuts are about cutting housing benefit for people who are renting in the private sector. That is less common in Scotland. Scotland has a bigger social sector, and therefore those housing benefit cuts are less important for Scottish housing benefit recipients than they are for those in the rest of the UK. And at the very top of the income distribution, the gains are a little bit bigger. That's because part of the takeaway at the top of the income distribution is a clamp down on pension tax relief for those fortunate enough to have incomes above £150,000 a year. Those individuals are disproportionately in London. They're not disproportionately in Scotland, and therefore Scottish taxpayers don't bear as much of a hit from that as the UK average. So in terms of how Scotland compares to the UK as a whole, the losses at the bottom slightly smaller, the gains at the top slightly bigger. So that shows you that on average, we're seeing losses at the bottom of the income distribution, much smaller changes higher up. What does this mean for incomes as a whole? It's not just benefits and taxes that will affect incomes, it's also what happens to earnings and employment. And we have produced some simulations which try and project growth in incomes right across the income distribution. So we're not just trying to say what happens to average incomes, we're trying to say what's going to happen to incomes at different points of the distribution over the next 5 years. So this is a period where we're expecting to see private sector wages outstrip inflation, so people in work will see real increases in their income. We're also seeing those benefit cuts and those tax changes as I presented on the last chart. And the pattern of income growth over the next 5 years looks like one where towards the bottom of the income distribution there's no real growth. So these individuals are not becoming poorer in real terms. Growth in their wages are just about enough on average to offset the benefit cuts they're experiencing. Whereas further up the income distribution, households that are less affected by the measures are seeing wage growth and their incomes are growing. So overall, we're expecting this 5-year period to be one in which income inequality is widening. Before you leap to the conclusion that this is clearly obviously unfair, it's important to remember the context of what went before it. If we take the period from 2007 to 2015 and show you what happened to incomes over that period, you can see it was a period where incomes grew towards the bottom of the income distribution, but fell at the top. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, the financial crisis and recession has been associated with very, very weak wage growth. Wage earners tend to be towards the top of the income distribution, so they were getting a hard time because those wages were barely keeping up with inflation, if at all. At the bottom of the income distribution, there was increases in benefits, and particularly in the early years of the financial crisis, that were in excess of wage growth and in excess of inflation in some cases, boosting those incomes. So you can see we've had a period between 2007 and 2015 where it looks like income inequality has been reducing, and we're going to follow that with a 5-year period where income inequality will widen. If we take the period as a whole, it looks pretty flat. Across most of the income distribution, it looks like income growth is going to be pretty uniform. On average, income's growing by about 9% over this period, which spans about 13 years, which is a very, very weak period of income growth. Normally, you'd expect incomes to grow at about 2% per year, so getting sort of 9% growth over a 13-year period is a pretty horrendous period of economic performance, and it looks like the spoils of that economic growth over the period as a whole will be relatively evenly spread, at least in terms of the overall income distribution. So what about spending, public spending, and in particular spending on public services? Well, the graph here shows you total public spending as a share of our economy, and the Chancellor's forecasts imply public spending falling to its lowest level in over 60 years, with the exception of 1999, 2000, 2001, when the new Labour government got spending down to a lower level than what Mr. Osborne is aiming for. So we're aiming to get to a budget surplus with quite a low level of public spending. Within that, we have spending on pensioner benefits. Over the next 5 years, they're forecast to be roughly stable as a share of GDP. State pensions are becoming a bit more generous. The pensioner population is not growing that fast because of increases in the state pension age. But working age benefits are being cut back, in particular the £12 billion of welfare cuts that the Conservatives set out in their manifesto. And if the forecasts for working age benefit spending are kept to, it would imply spending on those benefits going to their lowest level since 1990-91. So we're set to see a period where overall public spending is falling to a relatively low level by historical standards, and spending on benefits for working age individuals also falling to a relatively low level. So what about that spending on public services? Well, going forwards, the government is now looking for cuts to day-to-day spending on public services. So this is how much central government spends on things like wages and salaries of public sector workers. That's falling by 3.7% or £12 billion between the last financial year and 2019-20. So that perhaps doesn't feel so ambitious. It's taking about 1% a year off for 4 years. But it's important to remember that we now have a growing list of areas which are exempt from cuts. So the NHS is not having its budget cut, schools are not having their budgets cut, at least in England, and defence budget is now protected too. So once you protect the majority of what government does, so schools, hospitals and defence are over half of spending on public services, you get much, much bigger cuts elsewhere. So that 3.7% average cut becomes a cut of 12.8% to the unprotected areas. So a cut which does look very difficult to achieve. It's worth noting that on average the cuts in Scotland will be somewhat smaller than this. If delivered, it means that the total cut to day-to-day spending by central government departments will be about 11% over the decade as a whole. The government will have cut spending by about 11% over a 10-year period. But again, the story looks very different once you look outside the protected areas of health, aid, defence and schools, where the cut will look more like 30% over and above economy-wide inflation. So on average, on areas of spending such as police, transport, local government services, etc., the amount we spend in 2019-20 will be over 30% down on what it was in 2009-10. So they are really, really very deep cuts. And if anything, the headline numbers understates the challenge. There's been some revaluations to public service pensions, which means public sector employers are going to have to pay more into those pension schemes. So for those public sector employers, that feels very much like a spending cut on them. And if you incorporate that, the 3.7% cut that we need over the next 4 years becomes a 4.3% cut. And there's also a whole load of other pressures that are coming about because of government policy. So the national insurance charge on employers for whom their employees are in final salary pensions has gone up. That happened in April. The majority of that was falling on the public sector because final salary pensions are pretty rare now in the private sector. There's the increases in the minimum wage for those aged 25 and over, which are affecting some parts of the public sector too, in particular social care. And there's the apprenticeship levy, which is affecting all large employers, including the public sector. On top of that, we have a growing population, which is going to place more demands on public services, and a population which is aging, which will place more demands, in particular, on the health system and on the social care system. So very challenging to deliver those spending cuts. So that turns us to some of the risks. What are the risks around these forecasts? Why might it be the case that revenues or spending do not turn out as the Chancellor expects? And I'll start with revenues. As ever, there's lots and lots of reasons to think the forecast may turn out to be correct. That it could be we'll get more tax revenue, it could be that we will get less. The most obvious is uncertainty around the path of the economy. If the economy turns out to be bigger than we expect in 5 years' time, we can expect to get more tax revenue. If it turns out smaller, we will get less. If the economy turned out to be just 0.7% below what we expect at the end of this Parliament, that would be enough to eliminate that 0.5% of GDP surplus that Mr. Osborne is banking on. It's worth noting that the forecasts assume that we stay in the European Union. It's fair to say, I think, that most economists think that if we did leave and this did reduce the amount of trade that we did with the rest of the world, this would most likely reduce GDP and therefore weaken the public finances. It's not just about the level of GDP. What also matters is how that's distributed between different types of economic activities, how it's distributed between different individuals, what happens to asset prices. All of these things affect tax revenues. And we can give an example on that. The government collects a large slice of its money through PAY income tax and national insurance, about £262 billion in the last financial year. And supposing we get 1% more employment income in the economy, well, if that happens because there's 1% more people employed and they're all earning kind of average salaries, then obviously that just boosts tax receipts by 1%. However, if you get 1% more employment income in the economy, and that isn't because there are more people in work, it's because the people in work are earning more, you actually get a 1.5% increase in your revenues, because it's better for the public finances to have fewer people earning more than to have lots of people earning less, because you have lots of people earning less, you're handing out more personal allowances, you're collecting less rate tax, for example, at the higher rate. And what we've seen in the last few years has actually been the forecasts surprising the government in terms of employment being much, much stronger than they forecast, but earnings being much, much weaker. Now that may be very, very good for society in terms of the equity and how the pain is being shared out. There are fewer people who are having the scarring of unemployment and the squeeze on total employment incomes being shared more equally across individuals, but it's bad for the public finances because we're handing out more personal allowances, as I say. So we've got a kind of high employment, low earnings mix going on at the moment, and that's not very tax rich. So that's the risks, the kind of underlying receipts, why receipts might not turn out as we expect if we sit back and do nothing. But there's also future policy changes. We're going to have budgets and autumn statements over the next few years, and no doubt the Chancellor will announce new changes. And there's various reasons why I think you might expect those changes to be giveaways rather than takeaways. The first relates to how we index fuel duties. Fuel duty revenues are an important source of tax revenue for the government, and the forecasts assume that every single April, the rate of fuel duty will go up in line with the retail price index. So that's what's assumed in the forecast, because that's what official government policy is. But it's worth noting that Mr. Osborne has not increased fuel duties in cash terms since April 2011, and in fact, in the most recent budget, he didn't increase them despite the fact the oil price was really low. So that really low oil price, which was hitting him for a whole load of North Sea oil and gas revenues, you might have felt would give him the opportunity to have increased fuel duty revenues, at least in line with inflation, as his forecast had assumed, but he chose not to do that. And if he continues to freeze them in cash terms, that will mean we will forecast less revenue, because the forecasts assume inflation increases. And that will hit him for about £2.5 billion by the end of this Parliament if he continues the kind of practice of freezing them every year. There's also a load of thresholds which are frozen in cash terms by default, and at some point we might decide that these are not sustainable. So, for example, the point at which you become liable for income tax at the 45% rate, £150,000 a year, that's been frozen in cash terms since it was introduced in April 2010. Now, obviously, people will make different judgments about where they want that threshold to be, but it seems rather curious to set it in April 2010 at £150,000 and then leave it there forever, which is what the forecasts assume. And now we have 40% more people facing this additional rate than what did when it was first introduced. And the numbers facing that will continue to grow unless we index that threshold. Presumably, at some point, we will do that. In terms of something that affects far more individuals, very, very few people pay the additional rate of income tax, we've got the takeaway of child benefit. That starts to be withdrawn if you're in a household where somebody has an income above £50,000 a year, and that £50,000 threshold is again frozen in cash terms. So as incomes rise, more and more families are going to experience some or all of their child benefit being taken away from them. And we forecast that over the next 5 years, if we keep with the policy of freezing this threshold, the numbers facing this withdrawal will grow by 50%. And again, presumably at some point we will choose to index this threshold rather than allow it to apply to more and more people. The final policy risk on tax I want to highlight is income tax cuts. In the Conservative Party manifesto, it said that they wanted to deliver a personal allowance of £12,500 and a higher rate threshold of £50,000 by April 2020, before the date of the next general election. One thing to note in this is that the national insurance upper earnings limit is currently linked to the higher rate threshold. So if you're a higher rate taxpayer, what the government is really proposing here is to take some of your income out of higher rate tax, so tax it at 20% instead of 40%. But if your income is earned, because it's increasing the UEL, that's the point at which national insurance rate drops from 12 to 2, it will tax you at 12 on more of your earnings than it currently does, instead of 2. So your national insurance rate will go up by about 10%, but your income tax rate will go down by about 20. So overall, you're going to win from this. Now, if we sat back and did nothing, we wouldn't get to £12,500 or £50,000. The government, if it wants to deliver on this promise, it's got to give away of about £3 billion that it needs to pay for somehow, or it will be £3 billion on borrowing. And it's worth noting, in terms of the amount of the people who benefit from this, 43% of adults have an income below the personal allowance already, so they don't pay any income tax, so they don't gain. It's the rest of the adult population, the kind of richer half, who pay income tax and therefore would benefit. So that's the Conservative policy. Then you get quite an interesting interaction when you look in the SNP manifesto. They've said they want to increase the personal allowance by more than the Conservatives. They want to do an extra £250, so they want to get it to £12,750. But they want to freeze the higher rate threshold next April and then increase it only in line with inflation thereafter. So they're looking to have a giveaway through an increase in the personal allowance, but not have any giveaway in terms of income tax. And they estimate that in total over this Parliament, that will raise them a cumulative £1.2 billion. Now, where I think this is particularly interesting is that if this policy goes ahead, the higher rate threshold in Scotland will be below the upper earnings limit. So some people will be paying income tax at a rate of 40%, at the same time as they pay national insurance at a rate of 12%. So essentially the Conservative Party will be increasing the national insurance rate from 2 to 12 on these people, and in the rest of the UK compensating them with a cut in their income tax rate from 40 to 20, leaving them better off. In Scotland they won't get any of that compensation, they'll be made worse off, and they'll face a combined income tax and national insurance rate of 52%. So if you're opposed to income tax and national insurance rates in excess of 50%, you presumably would not like this policy. And to give you a sense of scale on the gains and losses, this is the gains from the Conservative policy. So comparing a world where we just took policy as given as of today, compared to one where we uprate all thresholds in line with inflation, compared to one where the Conservatives get to their pledge, you see that there is a gain for basic rate taxpayers. They're gaining nearly £200 a year, and that's the vast majority of taxpayers. One thing I could stress about this graph, there's only about 10% of taxpayers to the right of the £50,000 a year level. Then you get the increases in the higher rate threshold, meaning that people who are above that level are gaining, and they're paying more in national insurance, but they're more than gaining from the cut to their income tax, so they're seeing gains of about £600 a year. Then you get to the lucky few who are earning above about £127,000 a year. They have those increases from the personal allowance clawed away from them, so they don't gain from the increase in the personal allowance. What happens under the SNP? Well, the vast majority of taxpayers, basic rate taxpayers, would gain more. The extra £250 on their personal allowance means that they will gain 20% of that sum, so about an extra 50 quid per year. But if your income is from earnings and you're a higher rate taxpayer, you'll pay more in national insurance because of the Conservative Party policy to push up the UEL, but you won't get the cut in income tax that the Conservative Party is giving the rest of the UK to compensate for that, because the SNP are freezing and then only inflation indexing the higher rate threshold. So higher rate taxpayers who get their income from earnings will find that overall, in terms of their national insurance bills and income tax bills, they'll be worse off, and the lucky few earning more than £125,000 a year will be worse off by a slightly larger sum. And I think this kind of pattern is essentially a feature of what's happened, given that we've devolved some taxes to Scotland. Some taxes have been devolved to Scotland, income tax. Others have not, national insurance, and the SNP don't have control over national insurance. They're making an income tax change. Maybe they're doing it in the knowledge of what's happening to national insurance. Maybe they're not. But it doesn't seem likely that this is going to lead to a great system of tax policy making. And perhaps if we're going to devolve income tax to Scotland, we should also be devolving national insurance. For the vast majority of people, there is no difference between those two taxes. Okay, so that's the tax side done. Now on the spending side, clearly the biggest risk is that the government finds that it can't deliver the cuts to public services that it wants to do. The risk is that it finds that they don't manage to deliver the quality and quantity of public services they want with those budgets. And it's pretty hard to quantify what point that would become true. We've delivered pretty big cuts already. The government's been very successful at keeping to its public service cuts so far. One reason perhaps to worry is that the public spending cuts delivered in the last Parliament in large part came about through a squeeze on public sector wages, and that might be easier to do in an era where private sector employees are not enjoying wage increases. So very harsh settlement for public sector workers in the last Parliament, but people working in the private sector were often not seeing big pay increases either. Going forward, the government's looking to cap public sector pay awards at 1%, but we're expecting pay growth to exceed that in the private sector. So what this graph here shows you is the average level of hourly pay in the public sector relative to the average level of pay in the private sector. So on average, public sector workers get paid more per hour than in the private sector. That's not really surprising if you think, for example, on average they are better qualified. Surgeons earn more than people who work in coffee shops, for example. But you might care about how that's changing over time, the relativity. And going forwards, if the government's public sector pay squeeze is kept to and private sector wages grow as they expect, we will see the ratio fall quite considerably, and the ratio of private sector pay to public sector pay, the ratio of public sector pay to private sector pay will fall to its lowest level since at least the early 1990s, so it may become difficult for the government to recruit and retain the public sector workers that it wants. There's clearly a risk around this policy on continuing to squeeze public sector pay if it's the case that private sector wages start to grow. On social security spending, the government is planning a 4-year freeze in benefit rates for most working age benefits. That's not been attempted in the last 30 years, so we don't really know if that's achievable or not. No one's actually tried to do it. It's also trying to cut back on spending by moving from disability living allowance to personal independence payments. There is clearly a risk that we see further delays in that transition. If that happens, spending will turn out to be bigger than they expect. And that's something we've seen already over the last few years. So the chart here shows you the forecast spend on disability benefits as produced in March 2013. And then as in 2014, March 2015, and then what the Chancellor was presented in March 2016 before he implemented any measures. So you can see as successive forecasts are produced, because we get new evidence on how the reforms are being rolled out, the OBR is revising up how much it thinks we're going to be spending on disability benefits. They're now forecast to cost quite a bit more than what we previously thought that they would cost. When presented with this forecast, Mr. Osborne decided to respond with a cut to disability benefits, one that would have seen spending go along the path shown by the line that goes up and then down a bit. But of course there was then a subsequent U-turn, so we're now back on the pre-measures line with disability benefit spending continuing to grow. And clearly there's a risk that if this pattern is repeated, spending will end up being higher than what he forecasts yet again. And finally, there's a risk on debt interest spending. Interest rates at the moment are very, very low, but the government has a large amount of debt that has accumulated over the last few years. That means that we are exposed to the risk that interest rates increase, either because the real rate of interest increases or indeed because the rate of inflation increases. And so, for example, if there was a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates between now and 2019-20, that would hit the government for about £8 billion in the last year of its forecast, essentially eroding most of the 10 billion surplus that we have. So we're very exposed to the risk that interest rates rise more quickly than the government expects. Okay, so to summarise, the Chancellor set himself 3 fiscal targets. 2 of those have already been missed. One still stands, that's the commitment to eliminate the deficit by the end of the Parliament. If we get there, if we get to budget surplus and we maintain it, that will be something that we haven't achieved in recent UK history. So doing so will be difficult, and I think the commitment to do it in 1920 is a risky one. We don't know what the world's going to be like in 2019-20. We don't know how easy it will be to bring about a surplus in that year. It looks like Scotland's fiscal position is likely to deteriorate relative to the UK's. Of course, in the world where Scotland is part of the UK and we have the no detriment principle in place, that does not matter. It would matter under independence or under a system of full fiscal autonomy. The budget is being eliminated primarily not because of economic growth, but because of further increases in tax and cuts to benefits, which are going to squeeze the incomes of, in particular, lower income working age households. and through further cuts to spending on many public services outside of health, schools, defence and aid, the growing list of protected public services. Those cuts will not be easy to deliver. And there are many risks that remain. 3 questions that might lead to the forecast being missed. One is, will the economy grow as the OBR expects? Secondly, will there be further tax or benefit giveaways ahead of us? And thirdly, will the cuts to public service spending that are being planned really prove to be deliverable? And I will finish there. Thank you.
I'm sure we all agree that was a fantastic summary of the fiscal position, and very grateful to Carl for that. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has built up a truly impressive reputation for independence, and we at KPMG are incredibly pleased to sponsor this event this evening. I have to say, I'm sure you've all got lots of questions. We always do. So there are microphones here, and the team are ready to take questions. So when you do ask a question, if you do say who you are and the organisation that you come from, if you come from a particular organisation, that would be great. So over to you. Just want to step.
Hi, Nasra Bradley, University of Glasgow. You showed a slide where you forecast that if there were no tax rises or spending cuts, the fiscal deficit would have stayed the same. What type of growth did you assume at that point? And is it 2.4% that is currently sort of projected by OBR? And is it that you included any kind of investment growth in the sectors? Just to know, because that can totally change that picture. Thank you.
Okay, so what we did there was to take the current level of tax and spend that the government has forecast and subtract away the cost of the measures that it has implemented. So essentially, it is assuming that the costings were accurate. Now, if you thought that the fiscal consolidation had had a bigger effect on, a more negative effect on growth than the government believes, then those lines would not be correct. So essentially, is assuming the same responsiveness with the economy as what the official forecasts are doing. That's the story essentially, and it's because it's also what's driving the line that says, well, actually we had a 10% of GDP deficit, we're trying to eliminate it, and we're implementing tax rises and spending cuts worth about 10% of GDP. You either have to think there's not much underlying growth generating much revenue, or you have to think, well, maybe the tax changes and spending changes are having a bigger effect on the economy than is being assumed. But it's not the same as assuming they have no effect on the economy. It's the same amount as what the OBR is assuming.
Just while everyone thinks of their questions, maybe I could take the chance and use my position as chair just to ask one from my side. It was really fascinating in the Scottish examples that the difference with the NICs changes. Now, I don't think there's been much discussion of that at all. So really just, and the other point that I picked up, particularly with a Scottish reference, was the increase in disability spending, because that is one of the main areas of devolved welfare that's coming to Scotland. It's not so much the employment age benefits, but disability. So really just any thoughts on how sustainable that might be going forward?
Right. There's nothing unsustainable about the NICs or income tax change in terms of pure economics, at least. I guess what is potentially risky is that there will be a set of high rate taxpayers who will find that their income, their tax bill, their pay packet is going, well, the tax bill on their pay packet is going up, which they may not have expected when they heard about a freeze to a high rate threshold and an increase in line with inflation. They might have thought that their tax bill would not increase or not increase dramatically. So it may make the policy more uncomfortable to implement, whereas in the rest of the UK, the increase in national insurance that people will be paying this, people will be paying the increase in national insurance across the whole of the UK. It's not specific to Scotland. In the rest of the UK, if the Conservatives deliver their pledge, they'll be seeing a bigger reduction in their income tax bill. So they'll probably hardly notice the fact that their NICS bill is going up. So there's a question there about whether it will become clear to people that's what's happening, which government they will blame for this. The national insurance increase is being implemented in Westminster, but the rest of the UK is getting compensation with bells on for that, which wouldn't be happening in Scotland. On disability benefits, it's something that the coalition government and then the Conservative government have struggled with in terms of having reforms which are trying to cut spending by making the disability benefit test harder. So clearly the intention there is to take the people who are relatively healthy on those benefits and take the benefits away from them. So to have a less generous system that isn't less generous across the board, which would be easier to do, it would be easier just to cut the rate. They're trying to change the health test. And they've had lots of problems in terms of implementing those changes and often finding that the test is not delivering the savings that they hope for. They still end up with more people. They don't end up delivering the reduction in the number of claimants that they hope for, and therefore they end up with more spending than they predict. And I guess this will now become a challenge for the Scottish government if it wants to go ahead with, the one policy the last government introduced was the shift from incapacity benefit to employment support allowance. We're now through that. It has not delivered the savings we hoped for. The government hoped for. We're now in the world of shift from disability living allowance to personal independence payments, and the evidence so far is it's not going to deliver the savings the government hoped for. If that reform continues to go ahead, there will be a challenge for the Scottish government about whether they want to do the reform in that way, whether they will, and if so, will they underachieve in terms of the reduction in spending, just as the UK government has underachieved.
Thank you. I'll take a few questions to give you a chance. So we've got 3 hands up. So right at the back there, first of all, and then come to you, Joe.
Hello, I'm Alistair Ware. I'm independent, but was linked quite a bit to the education sector. I noticed that you repeatedly separated out schools as opposed to Department for Education in England. Is there a reason for that? Is it that, because I think now further education and higher education are not exclusively with BIS, but across with Department for Education. And is it that the schools are protected, but that the tertiary sector is now at risk in England? That was it, really.
Right. So that's schools and tertiary education. Joe? And then there's a third one.
I was fascinated by, on your slide, you demonstrated that public spending was at its lowest point at the end of the 90s. I was actually involved in running a council at the end of the 90s, and it didn't feel as if we were being cut back in the sort of way that we've been experiencing over the recent years. Can you give any kind of explanation as to why they were able to keep public spending down without looking as if they were reducing investment?
So that's schools versus tertiary education. Do governments really want to stick to fiscal rules and feeling in the 90s?
So in England, at least, the government's policy is that schools spending per pupil in cash terms is protected, and the number of pupils is roughly growing in line with inflation. So you could, it's cash spend per pupil that's protected. That's pretty similar to having real terms protection overall. Obviously not real protection per pupil though. So the school's budget is what's being protected, and it really isn't the case that the Department for Education budget's being protected. The other parts of that budget are being cut. I think that does include some parts of further education. It certainly includes some provision for the under 5s. Plus some other activities. So there are cuts, quite big cuts for the Department for Education budget outside of the schools bit, which has got the protection. And I think in the last Parliament, the schools budget did better than the other bits, although it wasn't formally protected. Now it's moved to a position of protection. The UK's record in keeping to fiscal rules is not a great one. The last Labour government had 2 fiscal rules which initially was clearly complying with both the spirit and the practice of, We then moved into an environment around the first half, sort of towards the mid-2000s, where they were arguing that they were complying with those rules, although it was questionable, and some of the changes they were making looked like they were motivated by making the rules easier to meet. But it was still the case, I think, that the rules had some traction on policy making and therefore still served some purpose. The rules were jettisoned when the financial crisis hit, and I think that any sensible fiscal rule that you had would probably have to be jettisoned when the financial crisis came along. I don't think there's any rule that you would write down that would be able to handle every single state of the world. There isn't an optimal fiscal rule in that sense. So jettisoning the rules at that point were the right thing to do. What's more questionable is whether the government was really complying with them around 2004, 2005, when they started to do things like redate the economic cycle in a way which looked pretty lucky. So, you know, whether they were cheating the rules a bit beforehand is hard to prove, but it looks pretty their behaviour looks pretty questionable. The coalition government, Mr. Osborne then had a rule which said that we will balance the day-to-day budget in 5 years' time. Of course, you never actually get to 5 years' time, so the year in which we got there was always being pushed back. That was a flexibility the rule always had built into it, and he used that flexibility. Not necessarily a bad thing. A nice feature of that rule is it allows you to take time to adjust when shocks happen. So things got worse, he was allowed to take 5 years, so he was always able to do it. Obviously, if you continue to do that, you question whether you really mean it. But you know, I think there are good reasons to have a forward-looking rule like that. And then we've had the rules made in the last year, which I think look far less forgivable in the sense of to say that in the time of the election you'll have debt falling every year as a share of GDP and miss it just 9 months later suggests you weren't really taking that rule seriously. It wasn't a great rule anyway, so I'm not sad to see it go. To spend a lot of time arguing that you need to have a cap on welfare budget because otherwise chancellors might take the easy option. Set a welfare cap in July 2015 and then in November 2015 arguably take the easy option of just U-turning on a whole load of tax credit cuts. Doesn't look like a great way to operate policy either. So you know, that's a very sorry history. Would I be surprised if we don't have a surplus in 2019-20? No, I wouldn't. And the final question, really hard one. So in the late 1990s, the Labour government came in 1997. It inherited very tight spending plans from Ken Clarke, which it chose to keep to, it pledged to keep to, and it largely did keep to them. Ken Clarke himself has said that he wouldn't have kept to them, and there's lots of evidence that, for example, the Conservatives previously had spent more on the NHS than their plans implied, and Labour chose to keep to them. So they did keep to very, very tight spending plans. Why were they able to do it? There was clearly, towards the end of the 1990s, lots of evidence of some problems with recruitment and retention of public sector workers. So there were some problems. Waiting lists in hospitals were rising. Some people were waiting, lots of people were waiting well over a year. It led to, and the level of investment spending fell to its lowest level since the Second World War. The response to that from Labour post-1999 was to increase spending pretty dramatically, to make the choice in 2002 to increase taxes in order to increase spending, something we haven't seen for a long while. We've had tax-raising budgets, but normally to fill holes in the public finances, not to explicitly spend more. With very large increases in spending on schools, hospitals, transport, law and order. So it doesn't sound like the spending was necessarily sustainable, or at least consistent with what that Labour government decided it wanted. I don't know about the individual situation in that particular council and whether the situation there was different though.
There's a question here. Just take one for now.
Thanks. Keith Griffiths, Economically Inactive. Two questions. Well, one very simple factual one. You mentioned, I think, that 43% of the UK population had incomes below the personal allowance. I wonder whether you happened to know the Scottish figure. Secondly, has the IFS done any work on the possibility and implications of merging income tax and employee NICs as a way of getting a bit more tax income from the elderly like me who don't pay NICs.
So, shall I take?
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm afraid I don't know the statistic for Scotland on income tax. I suspect it's available though, so I may, if you contact me by email, I may be able to look it up for you. Merging income tax and NICs. If we were in a world where we genuinely had a contributory principle and what people paid into the national insurance system in some way genuinely reflected what they got out, you wouldn't want to merge them. But we're really not in that world. We basically have two taxes on earnings, one called income tax, which also taxes other forms of income, and one called NICs. So there is a very, very strong case for merging them. There are some implementation issues you would have to think about. At the moment, people with multiple jobs get multiple NICs allowances. They don't get multiple income tax allowances. That may look pretty odd. You might want to tax someone who's got £500 a week the same as someone who's got income of £500 a week that happens to come from 3 jobs. So there's an issue there if you do want to tax them differently. The NIC system operates on a pay period basis, where the income tax system works on an annual basis. So NICs hits harder people who have incomes that vary through the year than what income tax does. So there'll be some winners and losers if you do the merge. You will hit people with multiple jobs, and you will benefit people who have variable earnings through the year. But maybe those things weren't really by design, and you think it's a good thing. You could, if you want, you could preserve a lower rate of tax on unearned income. You don't have to have merger with the same rate applying to earned income and unearned income. We often have a different rate of tax on savings income, for example, so you wouldn't have to do that. You could make the policy choice to levy some national insurance on unearned income if you wanted to, though. Similarly, we don't charge NICs on the earnings of those aged over 65. You could keep that in place, or you could put NICs, or you could put a charge on that if you wanted to. One thing we've argued at IFS is that pension tax relief is very, very generous, and one reason why it's very generous is that you pay no national insurance on money that your employer puts into a pension, either when you put the money in or when you get the money out, whereas most of the money your employer gives you is subject to national insurance, and this looks rather odd and rather generous and quite opaque. So you could argue that national insurance could be levied on pension income, not necessarily at the full rate of 12%. You could increase it. You could introduce it gradually at 1%, 2%, increase it gradually over time. It would clearly hit better off pensioners with some pension income. There would clearly be an allegation that it was unfair because it was retrospective taxation. Now, over the years since 1980, successive governments have chosen to increase NICs and cut income tax. We cut income tax, we put NICs up. That's what Conservative governments have done, it's what Labour governments have done, it's what the coalition government did. I'm not clear that that was because of a definite motivation to increase the generosity of our pension system. So it's not clear to me that that wasn't retrospective, kind of unfair in the sense of giving people a windfall who happen to have pension income. You gain from the income tax cut, you don't pay the national insurance rise. But it would be retrospective in some sense. I also don't have to stand for election. I suspect put national insurance on pensions is one way to not get yourself elected.
There was a question here. Any others for the moment? No, we'll take that one this time.
Hello there, Andy Milne from SURF, which is Scotland's Regeneration Forum. If I understood it, I didn't understand it all, but if I understood the first 2/3 of your presentation, it was a very effective and comprehensive critique of the UK government's fiscal policy, and then you came to identify a significant deficit for Scotland. If I was to try and channel John Swinney, I can imagine he might say yes, but we would then be able to, under independence, be able to make a series of decisions which are more effective in making the best of Scotland's economic assets, addressing its challenges, considering its difficulties more effectively. Would you give much weight to that kind of position of taking a different approach from the approach which you have criticised so effectively?
So it is certainly true that if Scotland got full fiscal autonomy, they would inherit a more challenging fiscal situation that would need to be addressed. It is also true there would be opportunities to do better policy making. The UK government has made far from perfect policies. There is lots of areas of tax policy which IFS is expert on, which could be reformed in a way which would be just as redistributive as we currently have, but more growth friendly. So kind of win-win. So there are policies out there that could be taken that would lead to Scotland growing quicker. Whether there would be enough to pay for that kind of deficit, whether it would be enough to pay for that deficit on a reasonable timescale, I think the jury is out. But there would be opportunities as well as challenges. The thing I think perhaps would question is maybe those policies are as hard to do for political reasons. So economists might go around saying, well, you should do this, you should do that. You should revalue your council tax. Why on earth are we taxing properties on the basis of what they were worth in 1991, which is what we do in England? Who thinks that's a good idea? Why don't we revalue them? But I know that Labour politicians and Conservative politicians are very quick when it comes to when we get close to elections to pledge not to carry out a revaluation. Now that seems like a revaluation seems like an obvious policy to do, but we don't seem to do it. And the same may be true of a whole set of other policies, which I would describe as ones which would not make the system, not change the progressivity of the system, do as much redistribution as we currently do, but make it more growth enhancing. They look like easy wins. Why don't they do them? And one might worry about the fact maybe Scotland would just do better. Maybe it would struggle with the same constraints that politicians in England struggle with.
Question down here, just at the...
I wonder if we could, sorry, thanks very much. Victor Wood, McIntyre and Wood. I wonder if I could ask you to consider your comments in a slightly broader context, because it seems to me that the economic circumstances of the country that you're forecasting in are really unlike any that any of us have experienced in this generation. By that I mean that, for example, inflation is almost negligible, so are interest rates. Productivity seems to be not growing in any sort of traditional way. There are all sorts of factors, many of them arising from the artificial structure and pricing of asset prices, all sorts of factors which seem to me capable of distorting any coherent forecast that you might be making, as indeed has happened already in the last few years. What have you got to say about that possibility?
So a key driver of living standards over the longer term is clearly productivity growth. That's exactly what we were talking about in the last question about whether Scotland could implement better policies and get more growth. It's about, can you do better in terms of productivity? And clearly one of the huge puzzles at the moment is what's happened to productivity performance since around 2010, or actually maybe it predates since 2007, or actually maybe it predates the financial crisis. Why haven't we continued to get better at making stuff at the same rate as what we did over the previous, say, 100 years or so? There are various stories out there. Maybe we're mismeasuring what we produce now in this new economy that we have, but is it really the case that measurement errors suddenly got worse around 2007? Maybe it's the case that we've just got lots and lots of people are now seeking work, and that's driving down wages, and it means that firms are just not making the investment in machines and new technologies because they can get a cheap form of labour, and they're not necessarily, so that we've kind of, firms are taking advantage of low wages by not investing. Maybe that's part of the story. Another part of the story might be that actually the financial crisis has caused problems in how capital is allocated across an economy, and what's happening is that kind of normally you'd get low productivity firms being destroyed, going bankrupt, the capital would flow away from them and go to high productivity firms, and that's how you get lots of growth. Maybe at the moment that's not happening to the same extent. Capital's just not flowing to the right places around the economy. Now, I don't think any one of these stories is going to explain all of what's going on. It's a puzzle for a reason. If I knew the answer, I would be very, very famous. but it clearly is a crucial thing. One of the reasons why we still have such a large deficit is because productivity growth has just disappointed so much in the last few years. Now, your question was kind of, why do we think these forecasts are right? Well, we don't. The forecasts will always be wrong. They're the best guess at what the world will look like. There is a chance, and we should hope we're in this world, that growth will take off far more quickly than the forecasts expect. With that, you would see tax revenues come in more quickly, you would see the deficit fall faster, you would see the Chancellor in a position where he could choose to do further tax cuts or not do some of the spending cuts that he's intended and still get to budget surplus. So let's hope we're in that world, because we can enjoy higher incomes, better quality public services. That's great. But equally, there's a chance that we get disappointed yet again, and that's the way the forecasts have moved in the last few years. Yet again, the date at which we think normal service has resumed, we get back to the 2% a year productivity growth that we were used to before 2005. We push that back, as what's been happening. We keep pushing that date back. Happens again, then all of a sudden the austerity you need to get to budget balance gets bigger. The squeeze on our wages gets bigger. It's not just about government tax and spending policy. Productivity growth feeds into wages, and we continue to, we end up with lower household incomes and potentially less spending on our public services. So, it can go either way. There's clearly an upside risk as well as a downside risk.
Donald.
Donald McRae, trustee of the David Hume Institute. You talked a lot about your forecasts for the effect on current spending. Could you say a few words about the prospects for investment spending in the next few years by both government and business? And I ask that because I believe there's a fairly strong link between that and productivity.
So in terms of government spending on investment, that was cut hard over the last 5 years. The incoming coalition government chose initially to keep to the deep cuts to capital spending that they inherited, the planned cuts that Alistair Darling had bequeathed them. They ended up cutting not quite as hard as what Labour had set out in its last budget back in March 2010. They topped up the plans a little, but still delivered deep cuts. Going forwards, there's no longer a cut on investment spending. It's growing very slightly, perhaps not quite as fast as the economy. So we're through, in terms of how far through the austerity are, we're kind of done on the investment cuts. There's no more cuts to come. And we're now at a level of investment spending in the UK which, by kind of the standards of the last 25 years, doesn't look particularly high, doesn't look particularly low. It might be sustainable. It might be sustainable for a while because we did so much investment in the sort of 2000s that we can get by for a while without having to repair schools, hospitals, etc. for a while anyway. So in terms of service delivery, it might be sustainable. In terms of private investment, one way the government has been trying to get more investment in the economy, in things like water, roads, broadband, is through getting greater private investment in that infrastructure rather than using public investment. It's been trying to get pension funds to do more investment, which is something it's found very difficult. Central government's pension funds are unfunded, so there's no money there. Local government's pension funds are very dispersed across a whole range of small funds, so they might not be very well suited to doing that. So the Treasury's trying to get them to pull together to bring the kind of scale that might allow them to do those kind of investments. And it's also been trying to change the rules to allow private sector funded pension schemes to get interested. But that's been really quite difficult. It's then looked at providing guarantees and other ways of subsidising the spending, if you like. So you see about the nuclear power stations, for example, being delivered with money from overseas, where there are taxpayer kind of guarantees on the spending rather than the taxpayer shelling out the cash itself. But it's found it very, very difficult to get a lot of this underway. At least it's found it very difficult to get as much of this underway as what it hoped for.
I'm conscious there's just take that last question there.
Hi there, Christopher Aiken. Jonathan Porteous and Simon Wren Lewis have recently written a paper which critiques government's fiscal rule on a broad range of issues. And one of the things that they highlight is its lack of conditionality on the zero lower bound. I wonder if you could just comment on that briefly.
Yeah. So the concern here is that when the in normal times, economists typically think that if the economy is weak, the right instrument to use to try and stimulate that economy is to cut interest rates. And your fiscal policy should concentrate on having a well-designed, efficient tax system that's dealing with the long-term public finance challenge and not also trying to deal with short-term issues of demand management. You might have some automatic stabilizers in place, but perhaps not fiddle around with the tax system over and above that. Now, this view comes into a problem if you've got a period where demand in the economy is very, very low, but you don't think monetary policy is effective. So that could be because you think interest rates can't go any lower than they are. At the moment, they're at 0.5% and have been there for several years. And you might think that quantitative easing has uncertain or small impacts. And therefore, the case for using fiscal policy might be greater. Now, Mr. Osborne's fiscal rule, of course, does allow him to borrow in that he's allowed to borrow every year up to 2019-20. We have a big deficit at the moment, 4% of GDP, not small by historical standards, not small by international standards either. And it also allows him to borrow if growth drops below 1%. So it has a get-out which is related to the strength of the economy. I know that Simon and Lewis in particular would rather we had a get-out which said that the rule gets suspended if interest rates are at their lower bound. But I mean, in terms of Mr. Osborne's current rule, if interest rates are above zero by 1920, which they are forecast to be, it won't be an issue. It would be an issue at some future year if we got to a zero lower bound and growth didn't drop below 1%. So I think the critique they're making is in some ways far more a critique about the last 5 years than it necessarily is about 2019-20 onwards.
Can I just finish with a last question? Conscious the EU referendum is almost upon us, and you did mention obviously that your figures assumed that we stay in. Just very quickly, how do you see that unfolding if we end up with a Brexit vote?
Mm-hmm. So there are kind of two types of economic effects. Well, there's a direct effect on the public finances of leaving the European Union, and that is that we would no longer have to pay any money to the European Union, so that would make the deficit a bit smaller. Far more significant are the kind of indirect effects on the government's finances. That comes from two main sources, or two or three main sources. The first is about uncertainty. There clearly would be a period in which there would be a lot of uncertainty. There would be concerns about what the new world would look like once the UK was out of the European Union. We know that uncertainty is bad for economic growth. So that might materialize itself by households and firms holding off making certain spending until they knew what the new world would look like. And the mere act of holding off that spending could lead to a period of weaker economic performance. On top of uncertainty, there's the issue of trade and foreign direct investment. If it was the case that leaving in the European Union led to a situation where the UK did less trade and had less foreign direct investment, I think we can be pretty confident that would mean that the economy would be smaller than it otherwise would be. Trade and foreign investment are both things that economists pretty much agree on are good for economic performance. So the question then really is, what would your trade look like and what would your foreign direct investment look like in a world where you're outside the European Union? I think that's much harder to judge. But if you think it's reasonable to assume that both of those things would be lower, then it's pretty clear, I think, that GDP would also be lower.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm conscious there's drinks waiting outside, and Ray's going to just finish off with a few words. But can I ask you to thank Carl for an absolute tour de force of the public finances and fiscal policy. Thank you so much, Carl. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl, for complex subject explained very easily, and we're grateful for that. And thank you also for Jenny for chairing the question and answer. Our next event is on the 25th, very different. We're going to talk about, well, we're going to ask about self-improving schools. Don Ledingham, who is both a former head teacher and a former director of education, has a view that the legal responsibility for improving education in Scotland, which rests currently with local authorities and not at all with schools, is probably not the optimum way of organising things. But he doesn't have a prescription to give us. He's going to ask for the audience to arrive at a new solution for how we organise schools and how we empower schools. I'm a bit hesitant because I'm not quite sure what Don has in mind. He's talking about technology involving mobile phones, so I shall get for the first time in my life to stand up and say, please turn on your mobile phones. So come along on the 25th and we'll find that out. Jenna referred to the EU referendum, which of course we haven't forgotten. We have 2 events in June on the EU referendum specifically, and we have, with the Centre on Constitutional Change and the Hunter Foundation, produced an e-book on issues which will come in the referendum campaign that is available for download from the David Hume website free of charge, so I urge you to do that. But in the meantime, can I just thank Carl again and invite you to share a drink with us downstairs. Thank you.